F.U.N Convention TV and Florida United Numismatists take a moment to explore the Borscht floor at the F.U.N show in Orlando, Florida. You never know what treasures await you on the convention floor.
The Honorable Robert E. Lee of Virginia is here, and he's going to tell you his story, or whatever. I'm going to give him the opportunity to speak, and then he's going to give me an opportunity to rebut after that. So, General, I'll leave it in your hands. Thank you.
It is my religion that teaches me that I must kneel to the cross prior to speaking to the people. And it's always wonderful to speak to the young people with so many dreams and so great a future ahead. And it reminds me of who I am and who I was as a young person. You see, I am the son of a son of revolution. My father was Harry Lighthorse Lee, and I yield to none in my love for that man. He rode with George Washington. And George Washington said of my father, said, if it was not for the Lee family, this nation would not have been founded on such a great democratic principle. They gave me great pride. And my father actually served for 7 years, Mr. President. He was a governor, legislator, and a husband to my wonderful mother. See, my mother was in a rolling chair and was quite sick, and she had many needs. But my father also was a gambler. And my father gambled on land speculation, ending up in jail. And it forever changed his life. He came out penniless, taking the fortune away from my mother, and actually became very embittered about war. And when the War of 1812 came out, and I was only around 3 years old at the time, he was against the war. In fact, my father became anti-war. And you know what he did, Mr. President? He went out, and there was a little paper, it moved from Baltimore, it moved to a place called Georgetown, called the Republic, which I thought was interesting, the Republican. And there was a great protest, and all these people were there mobbing because that paper was against the war. And they asked my father to come there, and so he came there, and he was looking distinguished as he always did, and he stood in front of the mob and the paper behind him and said, ladies and gentlemen, although you disagree with what this paper says, I will fight to the death for the right to say it, because that is the American way. And while he was giving a speech, a butcher by trade came and knocked him to the ground, and one of the people actually punctured his ear, and they poured hot wax in his ear, and he was hospitalized, and he left, never more to see him. And at age 3, I found myself fatherless. But the good Lord works in mysterious ways, and find ourselves fatherless, and we lost our house. We moved to Alexandria, and oh, Alexandria, that is where the magic began. Because you see, here in Washington City, and that's what this place was called, up here on this beautiful hill was a place called Arlington. Now, have any of you visited my home, Arlington? Oh, my wife, I'm sure, entertained. She's the most wonderful hostess. In fact, every president today, except for our current president, has visited the house. It was the socialite area. 1,100 acres. If we held hands, we couldn't reach around those 30-foot columns reaching in the sky. People said they was marble, but they weren't. They were plaster. But I didn't correct them when they said, oh, what beautiful marble pillars you have, because it wasn't my house. Well, this house, any of you believe in love at first sight? I do. I was 5 years old, and my darling wife was 3 years old, and we visited, you see, she was distant kin, and we visited our house. And that's when I seen her. I fell in love, and she became my best friend. And at the age of 12, I planted a tree with her. And that tree was a tree of endurement that still exists to this day. And I knew I'd found my soulmate in her. Well, you know, we must have been a soulmate. We have 7 children, and it's a wonderful little family. My kids, oh, you would love my children. I have one called Precious Life, little Mildred, and she's the fastest little thing. She plays piano. She's always running around the house, and she has a tendency to try to embarrass me. I remember once we had a bunch of diplomats in the house, and they was all doing their diplomatic thing, and that early morning, a man from England had sent me a shawl, and I didn't know what to do with it, so I was going around the house prancing with it, looking really pretty and handsome, and doing all the things, and I forgot about that. Well, as I introduced myself in my usual casual and very formal manner in this case, my daughter brings out the shawl and says, "Papa, show them how you dance." And I'm going, man, this is not the time for such things as dancing. But I had a lovely family. And family is what makes up the most important part of your life. But you see, growing up without a father, my mother became both. And my mother taught me to deny all things and serve the people. My mother said sacrifice, duty, all of these things are important. She instilled this in me. And when she let me go to West Point, I was bound and determined to be the best student I could be. And 4 years later, I graduated without my name on the board. We call it demerits. And I graduated that school without once going to one of their parties or big deals. All the things that they had, I did not go. And I was known as the marble man at those times. And I really thought I had, because it's based upon my mother, I really thought I had to redeem the good name of my father and family. And I yielded none in my love for this country. And for 36 years of my life, I served that glorious flag, the flag of my fathers. Oh, glory. And then the darkness came. And that terrible angel of death spread her dark wings upon the land, and war came. And I remember my time, Mr. President, as if it was this very moment when that knock came upon that door. And there was a young courier. I had just returned from Texas, and this young courier from the White House came and handed me a dispatch. I need not read it. I knew what it was. And it was the letter from the President of the United States requiring me to come to his office. My wife also in a rolling chair. You know, if you've been married a long time, they can read you like a book, and she could read me, and she said, "My captain." She always called me my captain because I was the captain of her heart, as she said. And she said, "My captain, you seem troubled." And I said, "My lady, men, the day has arrived that we have so dreaded." And so I had, I believe it was Darling Grace, a little horse I had brought back from Mexico. I had him saddled, and I remember going out and getting on that horse and going down that mile-and-a-half gauntlet to Washington City. And I went to meet the president. Well, newly elected president's name was Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States. And he was busy, so I met a distant cousin of mine by the name of Francis Preston Blair. And he's a very huffy man, very short, the words that said, "Colonel Lee, on behalf of the President of the United States, I'm hereby authorized to offer you complete command of the Army of the Potomac." Boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, complete command of the greatest army that ever existed. Here was the opportunity of my life to redeem the good name of my father. For you see, I knew that this represented the South from Arlington, and this represented the North. And I knew if I took upon my shoulders command of the Army of Potomac, a lot of the Virginians would follow me. But I had to weigh what price it would be. For my mother taught me a thing about honor. You must do the honorable thing, the right thing that you feel in your heart, regardless of the consequence. So I went home that night, and my wife was waiting at the door as usual custom, and she said, my captain, and I said, Miss Mary, I begged leave. Let me go upstairs. And I did go upstairs. My wife wrote in her journal, she said, I could hear my beloved husband. He paced back and forth in the hallway. And at one juncture, he fell to his knees and cried out, Dear God, take this from our country. Take this from our people. Take this from me. I'm unworthy to serve. When he came down those stairs, as if there was a great flow of blood that come from his eyes. But I saw in his countenance a resolve, nay, a peace. And I knew his decision without asking. And that night, boys and girls, she wrote, the house of Lee was the house of the dead. The next morning, my husband came down the stairs, and his traditional manners, he donned that old coat that he would never wear again, the old coat of the Federal Army, the black slouch hat. He tasseled the hair of the young lady that he loved so much, his precious life, his youngest. He then kissed me and bid us what to do. And I knew he had graced the house of Arlington for the last time. Well, I went down to meet this new president that I was going to serve under, or wasn't going to serve under, because I still dreaded that moment. And I met Mr. Blair because he said that the president was again busy raising those to put down the uprising. And Mr. Blair looked at me in a very urgent manner and said, Colonel Lee, have you made your decision? And I remember the following that I said, though I love this union, I love Virginia more. I cannot, I will not, I dare not draw my sword, save in her defense. And I hear her sing to me. She beckons me. She calls me. She says, Virginia, Virginia, Virginia. And I excused myself, and I resigned from the great army and went for one day to be a civilian, praying they would not call upon my poor services. The next day they called me to Richmond, and I served. And boys and girls, most of those soldiers, because I was a superintendent, most of those officers I had trained. And how terrible it would be for me to have to take upon my shoulders the great command of charge and see the very men that I trained fall on the very men I was serving. And upon my shoulders, I placed a heavy burden. But upon this 6'4" frame, I put another burden. A burden that he had to decide, and he had to fight against the very thing he so dreaded. The possibility of our union dissolving and the nation being no more. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to introduce to you President Abraham Lincoln.
Boys and girls, Civil War. Well, I'm not going to talk about that Civil War. There's, you know, in my opinion, there's no such thing as a just war. Or a child asked me, Mr. President, who won the Civil War? I said, well, I think the American people won the Civil War. He said, well, Mr. President, who lost? I said, I'm sure that the American people lost the Civil War. There are no winners in the war. Hold my hat, son. Yeah, my hat. Robert E. Lee and I had almost nothing in common. He was from a very well-to-do family. He was 2 years older than me. I was born in a one-room, dirt floor log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky. You know, I was about as poor as you could be. When I was a 7-year-old boy, I got my very first birthday present. My father gave me an axe. And from the time I was 7 years old till I was 21 years old, I almost always had that axe in my hand. I'm sure that maybe some of you scouts have used an axe, have you not? Yeah. You know how to sharpen an axe? Have they taught you that yet? Yeah. But you got to be careful with a sharp axe because it's made for one thing, and that's for cutting. You know, I remember at one point I was living over in Indiana. My mother had died, you know, when I was just 9 years old, and my papa got married again. And I remember the lady he married, she had 2 girls and a boy. And one day while I was out chopping wood, my stepsister thought that it was going to be a wonderful surprise to sneak up behind me and jump on my back all of a sudden, you know. Well, I had this double-edged axe, you know, that was very sharp. And she jumped on my back, and when she did, the axe hit her ankle, and it cut her very, very badly, you know. So you have to be careful anytime you're around a sharp instrument. My stepmother, when she moved into our little cabin, she was so angry because it still had a dirt floor in it. And she told my daddy, she says, now, I'm not living in this house if it's got a dirt floor. So he put down a wooden floor. And then she got angry because the walls weren't painted and the ceiling wasn't painted. And she says, I'm not living here if you don't paint the walls and the ceiling. So he painted them snow white, just like these tablecloths. Now, boys and even girls, have you ever had a real good idea that turned out not to be a good idea? Have you? Oh, I know you have. But one time, I had this real good idea. My stepmother was out in the yard. She was washing her clothes in a big bucket of water. When the water got dirty, she poured it out in the yard, made these big mud puddles, you know. Well, this was my great idea. I got my new little stepbrother, Jonathan. Come here, brother. Come here. What's your name? Daniel. Well, you're going to be Jonathan. You're just about Now, you got to remember, back in those days, we didn't wear shoes on our feet unless it was snowing outside. We always went barefooted. So here was my brilliant plan. I get my little barefooted stepbrother. I took him out in the yard, and I stood him in that mud puddle, and I squished him all around. He got mud all over his feet, in between his toes, and all up under his toenails. And then, I picked him up, I took him back into our house, and I stuck his muddy feet up against the wall. I let him walk up the wall, across the ceiling, and down the wall. I tell you, when my stepmother came in that house and she saw those muddy footprints up on the ceiling, she said, how can anybody walk up there? Me and Jonathan, we just laughed and we laughed. And then my stepmother looked at me. She said, Abraham, I believe you had something to do with that. I said, sure did, Mammy. Don't you think it was funny? Now, she said it was really funny. Then she gave me and Jonathan 2 big brushes and a bucket of water. Guess who had to clean all that mud up? We did. Give him a hand, will you? Now you see, boys and girls, there's a moral to that story because there's almost always a moral to one of my stories. And the moral of that story is the next time you, oh, and dads, moms, this goes for you too. The next time you have a real good idea, you need to think it all the way through to the conclusion, you know, because it might not always be a good idea. Now, we're here today because you are, I'm told, Numismatists. Yes, something like that, right? And that means that you have a fondness for collecting money, you know. And not to spend, you know, but to collect money. And I got to tell you the truth, see. As a little boy, I never saw any money. You know, in the town the little town that was closest to my farm, when you went to the store, for instance, maybe my papa wanted to buy some coffee. So he would go to the store with 2 chickens, 2 live chickens. And he would give the storekeeper 2 live chickens, and he would get 10 pounds of coffee. So you swap. They bartered, you know, you give me this and I'll give you that. I remember, like it was yesterday, I was living in Indiana, and I had made this little boat where I could ferry people across the little Anderson River that emptied out into the Ohio River. Well, one day these 2 very finely dressed men came up to me, and they had missed the steamboat. And they wanted me to take them out into the middle of the Ohio River so that they could catch the boat. Well, I row them out to the middle of the river, put their trunks on the boat, put them on the boat. They turned around, and each one of them gave me a nice, shiny $50. Now this one is $18.30. That would have meant that I was 21, but when I got my $50, I was 18 years old. Both of the men turned to me, they flipped me this shiny $50. I was so excited, I thought, here I am, a boy of just 18 years old, and in one day, in just 30 minutes, I have made an entire dollar. Do you know how long it took a man in those days to earn a dollar? Sometimes it took a week just to earn a dollar. I was so excited with my newfound treasure that all of a sudden I dropped one of them, and today it's still on the bottom of the Ohio River. But money was never a very important thing for me. You know, I finally decided that my daddy taught me how to work. Now, boys, I hope your father has taught you how to work too, but my father never taught me how to like to work, you know. And so I could do all kinds of stuff with this, but I thought there's got to be a way to make money with what I got up here. So I became a politician and a lawyer. And even as a lawyer, you know, money was not the most important thing to me. While my last law partner was much younger than me, and anytime I won a case, or he won a case, we split the fee half and half, you know. Now, my wife didn't like that. She said, you know. But in that terrible war that the general was speaking of, and yes, boys and girls, that was a terrible decision. Like, this war was unlike any war that we'd ever had. It was brothers fighting against brothers. It was fathers fighting against sons. You know, it was husbands, you know, fighting their own in-laws. It was a terrible. You know, my wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, 3 of her half-brothers were killed fighting in the Southern Army. Her brother-in-law, Benjamin Harding Helm, I love Ben. He was married to Mary's baby half-sister, Emily. And we watched them grow up. I always called Emily little sister every time I saw her. And then when Ben got older and married Emily, I'd call him little brother, you know. I loved him. He actually read law in my office for a while. Lee talked about his decision. When the war came, I offered Ben a job as a paymaster in the Army. He would have never had to see any combat. In other words, he would never be where the fighting was. He would just have to pay the soldiers. But Ben was from Kentucky, and that state was split. Even though it did not join the Confederacy, some of the people in Kentucky chose to fight in the Northern Army, some chose to fight in the Southern Army. At the Battle of Chickamauga, Benjamin Harding Helm, little brother Ben, was killed. A month later, baby sister, Emily, came to the White House to stay with me and her sister for a while. Again, there's nothing good about warfare. And you know what? If you're going to have a war, you have to have soldiers. You have to have weapons. You have to have food. But guess what else you have to have if you fight a war? You got to have a lot of money. It takes a lot of money to fight a war. And we didn't have a lot of money, you know. I needed to finance the war, but the banks were going to charge us outrageous amounts of interest if we borrowed the money to pay for the war. So in my cabinet, my Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, said, "It's not a problem, Mr. Lincoln. Mr. President, it's not a problem at all." And I said, "Well, how are we going to get this money?" He said, "We'll make it." So we did. We made our money, and we called it greenbacks, and we financed the war with it. We were only going to use it for a short time, you know, but they used it for a lot longer than that. Boys and girls, that war lasted for 4 long years. It cost a terrible amount of money, but it cost an even more terrible price in human lives. In 4 years, 623,000 Americans lost their lives fighting for what they believed. One side believed. You know what was sad? Both sides read the same Bible. Both sides prayed to the same God, and each invoked his aid against the other, and the prayers of both couldn't be answered. That war dragged on. I had to do a lot of things I didn't like. At one point, I had to go to a little town in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. General Lee knows a lot about that. There was a terrible battle there. I feared that if he won that battle there in Pennsylvania, that his army would come out into Washington. I really feared that. In the end, though, we managed to win that battle, if you can call it that. But boys and girls, in 3 days, more than 50,000 American lives vanished into the mist and smoke and flame of a human storm. Several months later, I went to that little town to make a very short speech at a cemetery where some of my soldiers were buried. Now, boys and girls, understand, they didn't really want me to come to Gettysburg, but they had to invite me because I was the president. But I wasn't going to be the main speaker. No, they made sure they gave that job to another man. His name was Edward Everett, and I tell you this, he was the best speaker in the whole country. And he stood up on the stage that morning, and he talked to the people for 2 hours. Tell me what he said. Boys and girls, I spoke to the people that day a little less than 3 minutes. My entire speech has only 10 sentences, 272 words. And if there are any teachers in the room, only 18 of those words have more than 3 syllables. It's a very plain and simple speech, and even though I was sure that it was a failure after I delivered it, some people have remembered it. Boys and girls, this is what I said on that day. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggle here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It's rather that we be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us. That from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, and that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Boys and girls, that little 2.5-minute speech is a very good example that people will remember you not for how much you say, but what you say. They will remember you not for how much you write, but what you write. Unfortunately, there would be many more bloody battles after the one at Gettysburg. Too many more. Too many mothers would lose their sons. Too many wives would lose their husbands. And far too many children would lose their fathers. But finally, on April the 9th, 1863, after more than 623,000 Americans had lost their lives, General Robert E. Lee and his army surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, and for all intent and purposes, the war was finally over. But now, boys and girls, I had a terribly hard job to do now. I had to rebuild an entire country that had been torn in two and shattered to pieces. This morning, I did it's Good Friday, you know. Good Friday. It's a beautiful, beautiful day out there. And I did something this morning I haven't done in 3 years. This morning, I had breakfast with my family. Mary and myself and our little Thomas, our little Teddy, and my oldest boy, Robert, who had just come back from Appomattox. He was in General Grant's army. He did not see General Lee. He would pray now that this terrible war is finally over. After breakfast, I had a little business to take care of. I've taken Mrs. Lincoln on a carriage ride today. It's beautiful. You know, we put the top down, you know, so we could feel the sunshine. I was exceedingly happy because, you know, I really do believe the war's over. I really do. Mary got frightened. She said, Father, she says, I haven't seen you this happy since our little Eddie died. And I said, well, Mother, with this terrible war and the death of our little Eddie and Willie, we have both of us been very miserable. But today I believe the war is finally over. And you know, when I finish my term in office, we'll go back home. I'll take up the law to make us some money. And then, Mary, I hope that we can travel some. I'd like to see California, you know. Oh, and, you know, maybe overseas. I really have a desire to see the Holy Land, to walk that ground. Later that evening, Mary and I attended a play called Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington. And boys, back in those days, if you touched a lady's hand in public without your gloves on, you just might as well go ahead and kiss her right on the mouth. Because you just didn't do that in those days. People say, oh, did you see him? He touched her hand. You know. Well, we're sitting there watching the play. Mary is sitting beside me. We have a young couple with us, a young lieutenant and his fiancée, Clara Harris. And all of a sudden, I reached over with my bare hand, and I patted Mrs. Lincoln's bare hand. She looked at me and she said, why, Father, what is Mrs. Harris going to say with you showing me all of this affection in public? I patted her hand and I said, oh, Mother, he won't think anything of it. At that moment, an angry young man named John Wilkes Booth pointed a small gun just behind my left ear, and he fired one shot. And I became the first American president to be assassinated. You know, boys and girls, I was only 56 years old. And again, I want to talk about when they took all my belongings home to give them to the family. They took out my wallet. There were several things in it. There were some newspaper clippings. There was a pencil. There was a chamois to clean my glasses with, you know. But the only piece of money I had in my wallet was a $5 Confederate bill. You know, people said, well, why did Lincoln have that $5 Confederate bill? You know, I can't really remember. I don't know if someone gave it to me as a gift or whether one of them gave it to me to buy a ticket out of town. But, you know, it was the only money I had. But, you know, boys and girls, General Lee, come up here with me. Join me, please. We've stood up here today, both of us, and we represent images and voices from the past. But, boys and girls, every one of you in this room, every one of you, is a voice of tomorrow. And it's into your young and tender hands that the General and I are going to have to lead the whole world, you know. But we failed. We failed a lot. And we're still failing. You young boys and girls in this room, I'm sorry. You've got a very, very, very hard job in front of you, you know, to help change the things that are still wrong in this war. But the General and I are going to show you something pretty special. Young lady, come over here and stand next to the General. Young man, I met you before. Get up here. And you stand over here next to me. Yeah, you stand over here. Yeah, that's all right. You don't have to be scared of him. He won't fight. And young lady, you come here with me. And you go on my side with me. And let's see. Let me get another toe-headed young in there someplace. That little fella right there. Yeah, get him over there with the General. Come on over, sir. Now, you see, what's your name? Justin, that's right. We've met several times. If Justin will stay in school and study real hard, he can someday find a way to end world hunger, poverty, and racism. What about her?
I believe this young lady, if she studies real hard, keeps looking at those books, reading, I believe this is going to be a fine doctor someday that will discover the cure for some of these terrible diseases we have. I believe in it.
And what about that little sprat there? You know, reckon what he can do.
I don't think he's going to be a politician, are you, sir? What's your name again? Anthony. Love that name. I heard it said earlier.
Yeah.
Anthony, what do you think you want to do in your life? You're not sure? But you know what? In your capable hands, you can do whatever you choose to if you apply yourself. There's no doubt about it. Doctor, lawyer,
Indian chief.
Indian chief, the whole thing, sir.
Yeah. Step over here, Justin. Now, darling, give me your arm. What's your name? Anaya. That is a beautiful name. Ladies and gentlemen, hear me very carefully. If this little girl right here will stay in school and study real hard, there's not a power on this earth that can stop her from growing up and being the President of the United States. Because guess what? In your lifetime there's going to be a lady president.
No doubt about it.
In your lifetime, there will probably be an Asian president, a Hispanic president, and if we're really, really lucky, in your lifetime, maybe we will have a Native American president. So you see, we're here for one reason and one reason only. Well, several. First of all, we want you to continue in this. I don't like to use the word hobby. Maybe passion for collecting and sharing coins and money. But you know, we want to beg you to stay in school and to read every book that you can get your hands on. Educate yourself, and then the general line, I think he agrees with me for once. We are going to demand that each and every one of you educate yourself and then go out into that big old mean world and do something good to help your fellow man and become everything you can.
Boys and girls, it's not in your veins. Ladies and gentlemen, it has passed from one generation to another. And the rising generation you see before us is the future. And we must let them be afforded every opportunity we can. Let us do that for America. Let America be strong with these fine young four representing all of you. This is a wonderful experience they're having. Life.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Tony and the Scouts, and on behalf of the Fun Show, General Robert E. Lee and I, and these four young people up here, bid each and every one of you a fond and affectionate farewell. Thank you very much. You know, don't stand up there. I got you. You know, Jacob might grow up and be the president too. Would you like to be the president? No? Well, I don't blame him. But you know, he held my hat. He didn't try to put it on. He didn't put anything in it. So we're going to see if he, I don't have a rabbit in there, you know. So we're going to see if Jacob could be the president. Turn around here like, now hold your head up just a little bit like that right there. Oh. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for letting us come in and speak.
Fun Facts Fast. You've been watching Fun Convention TV. Visit Fun Forums for Fun Show updates, videos, articles, photos, and more. Fun Forums. It just makes sense. This video is the property of Fun, Florida United Numismatists. Re-editing or use without prior consent is strictly prohibited.